Good Sunday morning, and thank you for your interest in our class, whether you're watching in person at Stevens Valley Church or virtually from a distance. We're going to be concluding our study of the 11th chapter of John today. The final, and of course, the most dramatic incident, the center incident in this 11th chapter is the raising of Lazarus from the dead. But we've been looking at the chapter in greater detail because of the importance of what Jesus is saying. And because in the process of the events of this particular sign, we're going to find this disclosure of so many great theological truths. So we're justified in spending more time. And the first segment, we looked at a part that I called It's All About Love, because Jesus was indeed motivated by the love that he had for Lazarus, as well as the love he had for Mary and Martha. So in that first segment, while Jesus was in Perea and before he goes to Bethany, he says several things to his disciples that are very confusing to them about this sickness doesn't lead to death. Lazarus is asleep and we must go wake him up, and let's go into Judea. All of these things were very confusing to the disciples. And Thomas makes that strange statement, let's go with him so we can die with him. In the second segment that we looked at last week, I entitled that, I am the resurrection and the life. That's another one of Jesus' I am statements. And this primarily is his conversation with Martha. And in that conversation, he is directing Martha to a deeper and more profound and accurate knowledge of what he is doing and of redemption. And it's a slow process, but he takes her very patiently through it. And then we see Mary's reaction. We see Jesus' reaction as he approaches the tomb. That's where we pick it up today. Thank you for being a part of the class. It is my prayer that it is a blessing to you and that you are going to hear truth and that God is glorified. So let's look at our study for today. I entitled this, Lazarus Come Forth. The Raising of Lazarus, Part 3, John 11:38-57. Now, let's reconstruct the scene. This is what we did last week. We looked at the scene. I'd like to go back to that now. Remember that Martha had gone and met with Jesus on the road coming into Bethany, hadn't yet arrived. Then she went back and whispered to Mary. Mary came quickly, so much that the Jews noticed that and went with her. So Mary arrives and falls at his feet. The Jews are standing around sobbing, grieving. And Jesus reacts by this groaning in his spirit, the shaking of his body, being indignant, even angry. And he asks them, where have you laid him? Their response is, come and see. So he walks with Mary and Martha and the mourners to the cave, and on the way he begins to cry. He begins to weep. And I asked the question last week, what were they thinking at the time? We don't know what they're thinking. We know what Jesus was thinking. We don't know what they were thinking. Did anybody anticipate what actually happened? So let's look at the first part of our study for today, the text from verse 38-44. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." So we see the second time that John mentions this being deeply moved, this groaning in his spirit. Of course, we noted last week, he's standing in the presence of death, and physically he's come even closer to it now. The death of one whom he loved quite deeply, and so he is deeply moved as he arrived at the tomb. We looked at the word, this interesting Greek word, embryomai, which comes from a term referring to animals like horses or bulls snorting with anger. And so the Greeks developed this word to mean to have indignation on something, to blame something or someone, to sigh with chagrin, or to sternly enjoin, or straightly charge, or groan, or murmur against. And this is not the only time Jesus wept. It is probably the most famous occasion, but he'd wept over Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I would have gathered you as a hen gathers her chicks, but you would not. He wept again in Gethsemane. But this significance here is very great, very deep. Now, the tombs, such as this tomb that we find in Palestine, because of the many caves that were there, were often in caves that were covered by large stones. In reference to Jesus being buried in a cave, which he was, we know that the stone was rolled. So it was a round stone, like a millstone, that covered the entrance to Jesus' tomb. It is thought that it rolled a bit uphill and that there was a depression right in front of the cave entrance, so that the round stone would simply drop into that depression, and therefore it would be fixed, it would be firmly situated so it would not be moved. There's a remark that probably was inserted, not an inspired remark, but probably by an early monk who was copying the scriptures. It's in the Gospel of Mark, where that the writer said it would take more than 20 people to move that stone. Well, that is an observation that is probably accurate. We do not know if this particular tomb of Lazarus was similar to the one of Jesus, in other words, covered by a round stone. It may have been a rectangular shaped stone. At any instance, it's a cave covered by a stone. Now, burials involved anointing the body, covering them with linen strips, with spices sprinkled in the folds. Now, these spices would help to lessen the odor of the decomposition of the body, but do nothing to prevent it. So that's the situation at the cave. And then Jesus said something that probably shocked everybody. Take away the stone. And Martha is very shocked by it. The sister of the dead man said to him, "Lord, by this time there'll be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." Now that stone would protect the body from predators, for instance, animals getting in, causing problems. It would also lessen the odor to anyone who came to mourn at the tomb, and it would also provide dignity in covering the body. So all of those reasons, the stone is there. And so Martha thinks, why are you saying this? Obviously, it's going to open up the tomb for animals to enter. It's going to cause Lazarus to be exposed, the body to be exposed. But her concern primarily is the odor of decomposition. Now, the Jews demanded that burial be for 4 days to determine that the person was actually dead. Because sometimes people were buried still alive. They did not embalm them then. And the presumption is that in some way a person could make himself known if he was still alive by yelling or something like that. Or if they opened it up and found out too late that he had moved and was alive. But this would certify, indeed, that the person was dead. He had died. And so the 4 days was required. Remember that Jesus deliberately delayed coming for 2 days, which caused some concern to both Mary and Martha. because they both said, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But he waited that 4 days, which meant, yes, Lazarus was actually physically really dead. Interesting that conversely, Jesus was in the tomb 3 days, which fulfilled the prophecy of Psalm 16:10, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol or let your Holy One see corruption. Now, being there 3 days was not enough time for the body to see corruption, and thus the fulfillment of the prophecy. Now, the idea of a resurrection of Lazarus was not apparently in Martha's mind. She doesn't say anything to indicate that. And we know no more about what's in people's minds than what is revealed, as Scripture says. We can't know that, only it must be revealed by the spirit of the person. And so we don't know about Martha's thoughts. As far as Mary's concerned, if anybody in that audience did believe that there would be a resurrection of Lazarus from the dead, it would be Mary, but we don't know that either. Now, what we do know is the thinking and the emotion of Jesus. His emotion was personal, it was deep, he was grieving, he was groaning, he cried. And we know that he was thinking about what he was going to do, because he had told his disciples earlier that this was for the glory of God. He told Martha that. And so this was going to be an incident that will not end in death, but it would end in God and in the Son of God receiving glory. So we know about Jesus' thoughts. And now Jesus says to Martha, reminds her of what he said. Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? Now, normally we say seeing is believing, and that's generally true. To see something that has happened, to witness it, is a basis for believing that it happened. That belief follows and is based upon our seeing. Not with this statement. What Jesus is saying reverses that, turns it around. He told Martha, believing is seeing. If you believe, you will see. Now, it makes a big difference whether that's in the context of speaking of man or God. If we're speaking of something about man, well, of course, seeing is believing. Only with God would it be a matter of believing is seeing. In other words, faith in God, faith in Christ. So these were the words spoken to Martha. And we try to imagine Martha's thought at this point, just when he says this, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? What is going through Martha's mind? I'm about to see the glory of God. Did that mean she thought he is going to raise my brother from the dead, or something else? We do not know. So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that you may believe, that they may believe that you sent me. Dr. Boyce, in his commentary, refers to the faith of Jesus, his faith that the Father always hears him, absolute confidence. And he comments that Jesus' faith in God was personal, very personal. It was perfect faith, something we don't attain, and it was public. It was expressed publicly. Personal faith, perfect faith, public faith. Now, the faith of Martha is not, of course, that great. Her faith has, I think, considerably improved through this incident, and much of this incident is for her benefit as well as for the benefit of the people. And the crowd obviously does not have that great a faith at this point, but the crowd obviously is going to benefit from it, as we shall see. Now, imagine the scene again. At this point, when the stone is removed and when Jesus prays to the Father, all eyes would be straining to see what is going to happen. Now, Jesus lifted up his eyes to heaven. That is a natural posture of prayer. Jews often prayed looking up to heaven, believing that God is above. Sometimes they knelt. Sometimes they bowed their heads. Many times in the early church, they followed this particular posture. And we see early paintings in catacombs, for instance, of Christians standing with their arms raised and looking up to heaven. That particularly was called the orans posture. Orans means praying. So the praying posture, looking up to God. Now, the statement that Jesus makes, I thank you that you've heard me. I knew that you always hear me, refers, of course, to that absolute unity that existed between the Father and the Son. We have seen the unity that existed in terms of their power. Talked about that in the last 2 weeks. And now we see it in terms of course, their very essence, their very purpose, their minds, their wills, absolute unity. And he comments to the Father, which of course he didn't need to do. The Father would know it anyway. But he's saying, I know you hear me, Father. I'm saying this because of all these people standing around. This is going to be for their benefit. And when he said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. You might say this was the effectual calling of Lazarus from death to life. And he specifies Lazarus. I've heard people say, if he hadn't specified Lazarus, all the dead would come forth at that point. That's the power of Christ. I don't doubt that. Personally, I like this interpretation better. He calls Lazarus by name because of his love. You remember in the Good Shepherd sermon, the Good Shepherd calls his sheep by name. The shepherd calls his sheep by name and they follow him. There's that personal relationship in which the shepherd knows his sheep by name. And I think that's the case here because Lazarus is one of his sheep and he loves Lazarus. He called him by name and he followed. He came even following him out of death. Now, some people say, did this call of Jesus then make Lazarus alive? Or did Jesus make Lazarus alive prior to the call in order to hear the call? Well, Linsky insists it was simply the call. It was the very word of Christ. I tend to agree with him on that. Sometimes people will say, I can know when I was born again, my consciousness of God and of Christ in my faith, but that was before I actually was effectually called. Oftentimes, though, the new birth, regeneration, and the call of the gospel are simultaneous. And in this case, I believe it is. It's just simply the word of Christ that brings him from death to life and causes him to get up and come out of the tomb. So the man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. That's the condition he was in when he was placed there. And Jesus said to them, unbind him, let him go. Interesting that he came. I said it's the effectual calling. In John 6:37, Jesus says in the Bread of Life sermon, all the Father gives me will come to me. Well, that includes Lazarus. And someone said, well, of course, Lazarus is going to die again. Yes, that's true. But the case is, even then, he will come to Christ in the call at the last day. So the called always come. We are called, like Lazarus, from death to life. That is, from spiritual death to spiritual life. In this case, a man who was spiritually alive before is called from physical death to physical life. Linsky points out this is the effect that is had whenever Jesus speaks to a lost and fallen child of Adam. That is correct. Anytime Christ speaks through his word and speaks to the heart of a fallen child of Adam, that person comes alive and follows Christ. That's the power of the word of Christ. Linsky said, without a struggle, death gives up its prey. All of death's ravages are undone. Here is the glory of the Father and the glorification of the Son, whom he did send. Now, remind you again, this is the seventh and final sign that John includes in his gospel. But he doesn't end his gospel without saying Jesus did many other signs, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, and believing have life in his name. Now, this seventh and final sign is the longest narrative of any sign. We've noticed it was 57 verses in all, and we've taken 3 weeks to discuss it. And the verses that particularly relate to the raising of Lazarus from the dead are 46 in number. That's longer than any other sign. And also the results are more momentous than any other sign, because there's a deep spiritual meaning here. It's striking, and it's essential in the theological narrative of the book, as we see parallels to Christ and to us, for instance, in the effectual calling. And I remind you again that in the Gospel of John, we have the great theological doctrines of grace, the salvation doctrines. They are there. They're there in beautiful illustrations, in stories. We find the same truths that we find elsewhere in the Bible, such as in the book of Romans. But beyond that, and I think that's the most important thing, but beyond that, the report of this sign led the religious leaders to the conclusion that Christ had to be disposed of immediately, and the activation of a plan. Now, from the standpoint of God, this is according to the divine timetable, a point that John makes over and over again in his gospel. Everything operates according to God's timing. Now, from the standpoint of the Jewish leaders, they were frustrated because they had tried to stop Jesus. Of course, God had prevented that to this point, but now the time has come. And so that is significant, because it is this event that causes the Sanhedrin Council to decide he's got to die, and to put into effect a plan that would result in his going to the cross. Now, from the human standpoint, as we look at it, we say that's a terrible thing. Jesus went to the cross. From the divine standpoint, Jesus had to go to the cross, because if he did not, we would have no salvation. And of course, from that standpoint, the devil understood that. He tried to prevent Christ from going to the cross. He's not going to be able to do it. And we're going to see at this point, John discussing in detail in the rest of his book that last week of Jesus' life. Now, thirdly, this also led to the belief of many people, as we shall see. So let's continue our reading now to the end of chapter 11. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our nation, both our place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. Jesus, therefore, no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness, to a town called Ephraim. And there he stayed with the disciples. Now, the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? That he'll not come to the feast at all?" Now, the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should let them know so that they might arrest him. So many of the Jews who came with Mary, saw what he did, believed in him. Some went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Now, Linsky believes that they actually all believed in one sense. It looks like what John is saying is the majority believed. Kind of hard not to believe when you see a man raised from the dead. But some of them, and we don't know to what degree they didn't believe, but some of them went to the Pharisees to tell Jesus what had happened, to tell the Jews what had happened about Jesus. And the question is, did they go maybe to say, you guys need to take a closer look. This man really is powerful. He has raised a person from the dead. In other words, that they went with a positive report. Or did they go like tattletales? Guess what he's done now? Doesn't make any difference. They informed the Pharisees, and the Pharisees informed the council. But we might say there's some division here, and I think John wants us to see that. Those who believed, and that was it, and those who, whether they believed or not, went to the Pharisees. This minority. Now, John Calvin has an interesting interpretation of believing here. He can't quite accept the idea that at that point, these many Jews had saving faith. They really trusted Christ to the point of salvation. So he thinks that believe here in this context means that it caused them to listen to Christ, that is to become his disciples. Now, in this case, I would differ with Calvin. I believe that they really were trusting in Christ because of the proposition here. The preposition is ace. You see it there second to the bottom and the bottom as well. Ace is, and here's by definition, a primary preposition. To or into. And notice this, indicating the point reached or entered. In other words, to or into a certain point, entering into that certain point in regard to place or time or purpose, result. When you think about that, into a point reached, what point reached would be under consideration other than the point of saving faith, of trusting in Christ and being justified by faith? You've entered into that. This is the place, this is the time, this is the result. So I think when you find believing into Christ, that's going to say the purpose is accomplished. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, what are we to do? For this man performs many signs. Remember, they never denied the signs. They tried on one occasion when the blind beggar was healed to say he never was blind, and he had to testify that indeed he was, and his parents did. Many times they did convene a council that was kind of an ad hoc council, but not an official one. This time, it is an official, regular session of the Sanhedrin. And this is as official as it can be. Remember, the Sanhedrin was the legislative power of the Jews, and because the high priest was involved in it, also the executive and the judicial, it's all combined. The Sanhedrin is the council. So they say, what are we to do? This man performs many signs. They can't deny the signs. They do not ever use the name Jesus throughout the Gospel of John. Any reference to him, it's something like this man, which Linsky says really translates to this fella, because this man is really not an accurate translation. It is more derogatory and impersonal than to say man. This fella performs many signs. But now what are they going to do? They've got to do something. They admitted to the reality of the signs, acknowledged he did many signs. Calvin says, but they didn't deal with the question of where does he get the power to do that? They know that he did it. Where does the power come from? On one occasion, as is recorded in the Synoptics, they said he gets his power from the devil, and Jesus showed that can't be true. The devil be divided against himself. They really haven't answered logically where he gets the power. He does have it. And then they go on to say, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. If we let him go on like this, implied we're not doing anything. The Sanhedrin needs to get its act together. We need to do something. We need to come up with a plan. And they did. To this point, they have been impotent in stopping Jesus. They've done nothing. He's gone right on. And of course, the point is God enabled him to do that. It wasn't his time yet. But they're frustrated. They've tried to arrest him. They sent soldiers to arrest him. The soldiers came back and said, never man spoke like this man. And when they surrounded him in the temple, and they were going to force him to say something that they would consider blasphemous, namely that he was the Son of God, he was God in the flesh, he slipped out again. So the Sanhedrin was not able to do anything. And their concern is, if we don't act now, everyone is going to believe in him. And you want to say, fellas, stop and think what you're saying. What is he doing that would cause everybody to believe in him? And if that's the case, why don't you believe in him? Well, they don't. And notice that what they really feared, and I think this is the expression primarily of the Sadducees and the high priest, what they really feared was political. If we don't stop him, everybody's going to believe, and the Romans, who of course had authority over Palestine, the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Look how they put that. Are they concerned about the people? Are they concerned about the nation itself? No, they're concerned about our place. That is our place as leaders of the Sanhedrin, our position of authority, our own power. And they're concerned about our nation. Wait a minute, I thought it was God's people, God's nation. They're calling it our nation, as if it belonged to them. Do you see the arrogance of these people and their love for power? I call it selfishness cloaked in patriotism. Their concern, and this is Lenski, their concern was not that they would lose the Sanhedrin, but that the Sanhedrin would lose the nation it dominates, and they are the Sanhedrin. And then notice this comment by Lenski. Yet the plan they adopted for maintaining themselves brought on the very calamity they meant to avoid, rejecting their true Messiah. Their temple and the capital were demolished by Roman fire and sword. Their nation was scattered to the ends of the earth, never again to possess their land or to be a nation like other nations. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole people, whole nation should perish. Now, Caiaphas is high priest, but his behavior is not in keeping with the dignity of a high priest. He blurts out, you don't know a thing. You're completely ignorant. It was an undignified reaction. It was a rude reaction. Now, a bit of a comment by Josephus on this. Josephus is an historian who was also a Jew, and some think he was a Pharisee. But Josephus said the Pharisees could be friendly. When they had problems among themselves, they could settle it. But the Sadducees, he said, continually fought with each other. He said they were wild. And Caiaphas issues an unintended prophecy and statement of truth. In other words, he said far more than he intended to say when he says one man would die for the people. His idea is that you put this fellow to death and it will keep the Romans from coming, which of course did not happen. But what really happened is a substitutionary death on behalf of the people that results in salvation. Now, again, the word on behalf of, and you see it here as one man should die for the people, that's on behalf of, that is the preposition huper. I remind you again that R.C. Sproul would say that's the most important word, a little preposition, most important word in the Bible. On behalf of, a substitutionary death. If one did not die, all would perish. That's true. What Caiaphas said is true. All are going to perish if this one man doesn't die. But it has a far different meaning than he intended. So it is the conclusion of the regular session of the Sanhedrin. Now we activate the plan that this fellow, namely Jesus, must die. Now John makes his own comment. He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. It is an unwitting prophecy of the atonement, gathering the children of God scattered abroad into one. It is an interesting case of verbal inspiration. Now, God was acting through this man like he's done before, even with Balaam in the Old Testament, causing a person to say something that they didn't really want to say. Now, what Caiaphas says in reality would be the fulfillment of what Jesus said in John 10:16. I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must go and bring them in, and it'll be one fold and one shepherd. Do you see that's exactly what John says he was prophesying? He would die for the nation, not for the nation only, but to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. Thus, a definite atonement, vicarious, substitutionary death for certain people. Now, that would mean that the people for whom Jesus died, that certain people defined as the children of God scattered abroad, defined as the sheep that are not of this fold, that would make their salvation a certainty, not a possibility. Those who believe in a general atonement, well, Jesus died for everybody, every single person that ever lived. What they're saying is Jesus didn't actually, by his death, save anybody. He simply gave all people a chance. I remember a man who used to lead a prayer in the church I attended, and he would get up and say, "Thank you, God, for giving us this chance of salvation." Now, a chance is not very good considering the power of the devil, but what Jesus did is not give people chances. He gave his people certainty. He gave his people salvation. As Linsky put it, a purchase of a people, God's chosen people in the grand new covenant, gathered from among all nations and peoples. Linsky goes on to say, God led him to voice it in such a way and with such words as expressed far more than the speaker himself realized when he spoke. Yes, definite atonement is a definite truth and a definite doctrine in the scriptures. And it is found not only here in the Gospel of John. Isaiah 53 in the Old Testament, verse 8, the suffering servant of the Lord is stricken for the transgression of my people. Matthew 1:21, you shall call his name Jesus because he will save his people from their sins. And that's the reason they could never use his name, because Jesus means the Lord saves. Matthew 20:28, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many, many. John 10:11, the good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. Ephesians 5:25, Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. Titus 2:14, he gave himself for us, that he might redeem us from all iniquity and preserve for himself a people for his own possession. And Hebrews 2:17, he died to make propitiation for the sins of the people. And so, John says, so from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. From that day on. You know how John, throughout his gospel, is very careful to mark time, to point out that God operates according to his timetable. And here's a good example of it. Here's the time, that day, that very decision that comes from that regular session of the Sanhedrin. The plot is now activated. It is now in progress. Now, of course, the council was made up of Pharisees and Sadducees, who normally hated each other. But now they have a common enemy that's brought them together. The Pharisees hated Jesus for theological reasons. They hated Jesus because he claimed to be God. They saw that as blasphemy. But the secular Sadducees and the priests who belonged to the Sadducee sect hated Jesus for political reasons. Remember, concern about the Romans and concern about their own power. So the Sadducees, who dominated the council, made the decision, and he is condemned for political reasons. And thus it was that Pilate put above his cross Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Boyce calls that determined unbelief. And what had Jesus done to deserve such hatred? I like the way it is expressed in this song that we sing. It's a beautiful song. My song is Love Unknown. Why, what hath my Lord done, which makes this rage and spite? He made the lame to run. He gave the blind their sight. Sweet injuries. Yet they at these themselves displease, and against him rise. They rise, and needs will have my dear Lord made away. A murderer, they say. The Prince of Life they slay. Yet steadfast he to suffering goes, that he his foes might thence might free. So Jesus was, of course, aware of all this. And John says, so from that day they made plans to put him to death. Jesus, therefore, no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness, to a town called Ephraim, and he stayed there with his disciples. Now, I'm sure he still discussed matters with his disciples, but his public ministry had ended. He'd done what he needed to do. It was finished. And he was waiting now for the time. He waited until the precise moment and then entered Jerusalem. And John writes, the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and saying to one another as they stood in the temple, what do you think? That he'll not come to the feast at all? Now, the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, they should let them know so that they might arrest him. So that's the reason they were wondering. Surely he wouldn't even come to this feast knowing he's going to be arrested. We don't think he's going to come at all. This Sanhedrin council was a momentous and evil council. Linsky says, Jesus brought back life to Lazarus. The Jews planned to bring death to the life giver. So Jesus went now to the obscure village of Ephraim. We don't even know where that was located. The people back in Jerusalem were very much aware of the council's decree, and so they doubted that Jesus would dare to come to the feast and risk arrest. But they were wrong. And we'll look at that, Lord willing, next week. So thank you for being in our class today, and I hope it has been a profitable study for you. I commend it to your meditation and consideration, and we'll continue, Lord willing, next week. So now may the Lord bless you and keep you, and make his face to shine upon you, and be gracious to you, and lift up his countenance upon you, and give you peace.